Hello, this training will cover indirect costs and specifically how to apply indirect cost as an ARPA State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund subrecipient. Note that the information presented here is based on federal guidelines as outlined in Uniform Guidance for Grant Awards. We're going to start out by defining indirect costs. For our purposes, we can consider two major categories of expenses, direct and indirect costs. Direct costs are costs that are associated directly with the administration of the specific grant award or service, while indirect costs are organizational costs that cannot be attributed to a specific grant award or service. In a moment, we'll go more in depth of an example of direct and indirect costs, but note that the vast majority of your programmatic expenses should be direct costs. Now let's run through how to calculate indirect costs under ARPA. As an ARPA subrecipient, you will have two main options for charging indirect costs. The first is a negotiated indirect cost rate, a NICRA, that's established with a federal agency. If your organization already has an established NICRA, you should use this to apply indirect costs. But if your organization does not have a NICRA, you should instead use the 10% de minimis rate. Under the 10% de minimis rate, organizations can charge 10% of modified total direct costs, otherwise known as MTDC, towards indirect costs. For the remainder of the presentation, we're going to go into an example of the de minimis rate and talk more in detail as what it looks like of applying against the modified total direct costs. So let's start by talking about how to apply a 10% de minimis rate for indirect costs. Note that if your organization already has a NICRA, you should follow the guidelines that are set out in the NICRA agreement to apply indirect costs. But for all organizations without a NICRA, you could use a 10% de minimis rate of modified total direct costs. To find the total dollar amount for indirect costs, you will first need to calculate the MTDC, modified total direct costs, then take 10% of that number. On the next slide, we'll go through an example, but for now, this slide details exactly what is included and excluded from the MTDC. So reading from the top, modified total direct costs are all direct salaries and wages, applicable fringe benefits, materials and supplies, services, travel, and up to the first $25,000 of each subaward. But MTDC excludes equipment, capital expenditures, charges for patient care, rental costs, tuition remission, scholarships and fellowships, participant support costs, and the portion of each subaward in excess of $25,000. Note that the modified total direct costs and direct costs themselves are different. Even though these particular items are excluded from the MTDC, does not mean that they can't be charged as direct costs against the program. The only thing that it means is that these can't be included in the calculation for indirect costs. So let's put this in the context of an example. Note the blue box at the top for how you'll actually make this calculation. So again, it's the MTDC times the 10% de minimis rate, and that's how we arrive at indirect costs. For an overview on this particular example budget, the expenses for this subrecipient are $285,000 in direct costs, but only $215,000 in eligible modified total direct costs. So the indirect costs are $215,000 by 10% times 10%. They're $21,500. Let's look more in detail at the table on the right to look at how that's broken down for this particular budget. So first of all, we have the salary and fringe benefits for two personnel, Janet Brown and Jack Black. All of these costs count under the modified total direct costs, as do the expenses of $10,000 each for travel and training. However, there's a $20,000 budget of equipment that cannot be calculated in the modified total direct costs. In addition, there are three subawardees. Recall from the last slide that only the first $25,000 of each subawardee can be included under the modified total direct costs. As a result, the ABC subawardee, which has $75,000 total in direct costs, only the first $25,000 of that will be applied under the modified total direct costs. For DCE subawardee, since the total cost is $20,000, all of the $20,000 will be included under the MTDC, as is the same for M&O subawardee with $25,000. That leads us to this $215,000 modified total direct cost number. And again, we multiply that by 10% to arrive at the $21,500 that are allowed under the 10% de minimis indirect cost rate.